Texas. Start verse 11. We're going to finish up. We've got one more week here in lesson. We'll probably jump right into lesson 2 as well. There we go. All right, so we've been looking at the beginning of Moses' life here as God is beginning to prepare him to become, of course, the guy that leads his people out of Egypt, right? And last week we saw Moses being spared, his parents, or his mother specifically, putting him in the basket, sending him down the Nile River, and then Pharaoh's daughter finding him and caring for him and taking him in, sending him back to his mother's house so that he could be taken care of and nourished and brought up for several years, and eventually bringing him back into the palace there in Egypt. So we saw training in his parents' house, training in Pharaoh's house. So Moses would be a guy that would be very, very well-rounded, very intelligent, well-versed in all the languages, well-versed in math and science and all the things being taught in Egypt as well. He was treated as one of Pharaoh's grandsons. Of course, Pharaoh's, as they went, eventually were put in positions of great power. So he would have been taught in leadership as well, and been through leadership training and seen how to lead people, probably led people, was in charge of leading people, I'm sure, in different instances as he was there. We saw back in chapter 2 here, verses 10, 9, Moses was mighty in words as well. Means he was a great orator, was eloquent in speech, would have been commanded respect. If he was up and talking, or probably would have been captivating to people. So Moses would have been, presidential candidate, right? He would have been one of those guys, probably better than a presidential candidate, but would have been one of those guys that would have been very, very noteworthy as he's kind of going through training. He was mighty in deeds too. We saw him over in chapter 4 talks about he had a good grasp of business, probably even reward. He'd been really well rounded. Then we get to verse 11, and we see all these different trainings. And we see that Moses ends up training in the wilderness. Of course, you know the story. What happens here? He kills the Egyptian, and the Hebrews see him do it, and the next day the Hebrews come back and talk about it, and Moses got to get out of there. But we see some training, some more God working on Moses to prepare him to become the guy that leads them out of Egypt, leads his people out of Egypt. So verse 11, first of all, chapter 2. And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out unto his brethren. And who would his brethren have been? The Israelites, right? Yes, the Israelites. So he would have walked out, and as we see, verse 11, out amongst his brethren, and looked on their burdens, and he spied an Egyptian smiting an Hebrew, one of his brethren. So we see 2 different times there, just specifically in verse 11, that Moses looking onto the Israelites, or onto the Hebrew people, and he recognized them as being what? His people, right? Now, how long had Moses been acting and living with the Egyptians? A long time, right? We don't know exact dates, probably 30, 35 years or so, but we don't know. A long time, and have been living that way and been, training that way. But we said this last week, at the very foundation of Moses' upbringing, when he was able to go back and spend time with his parents, they taught him some foundational truths that when he got in the midst of uncertain situations, same thing we do, right? We always revert back to what? What we know, what we're comfortable with. What we do. This is how we are. stuck in a situation, I don't know how to handle it, I'm going to revert back to what I know, what I'm comfortable with, what I've experienced before, whatever the case may be. So Moses here sees this as the Hebrews as being his people because of the training that he received when he was a young man. Obviously, great lesson for young parents, and myself, and the other few that have kids, and you guys do raise children who are older now. It's a great deal of importance of making sure that young children are taught foundational truths about Scripture, about Christ, about God, about what it means to be part of teaching people now, what it means to be a confident, right? There's specific things that means to be a confident. We go to church on Sundays and Wednesdays. We make sure we say our prayers. We're doing the things, so when she out on her own, she can revert back to those things, right? That's the same thing that Moses here in. And so we see that happen, right? We see Moses, even at an older age, reverting back to those things. And as he's out and he's seeing the Hebrews and the burden that they're going through, he notices that there was an Egyptian beating on one of his people pretty good. And it says smiting in Hebrew. If you look at the translation of it, the Egyptian wasn't just whipping this guy. He was trying to kill him, right? He was trying to use him and make a point out of him to the people who may have been around. Okay, so he was beating pretty good to the point he probably would kill him if he was allowed to go on. So Moses, as we see, made sure nobody was looking around, and then he kills the Egyptian, buries his body in the sand, verse 12. And he looked this way and that way, and when he saw that there was no man, he slew the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 men of the Hebrews strove together, and he said to them that did the wrong, wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? Okay, so Moses made sure nobody was looking, kills this Egyptian, buries his body in the sand, and then goes out the next day to again see these Israelites and their burdens. And he intervenes in between a dispute between these other 2 Hebrews, right? So see in verse 13. So the Hebrews strove together, and he said to him that did the wrong, wherefore smitest thou thy fellow? Okay, so he's intervening, trying to help the problem or help solve this problem, whatever the case may be. But we see in verse 14 that they come back and question him. And he said, who made thee a prince and a judge over us? Intendest thou to kill me as thou killest the Egyptian? And Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. So they're going to question him, well, are you going to kill us like you killed that Egyptian yesterday? And Moses realized that his murder of the Egyptian was known, and a word like that, Moses acting as an Egyptian, probably most of those Hebrews' eyes was an Egyptian, killing another Egyptian. That word would spread very, very quickly back at home, back at Canaan, where the Hebrews would have been. So he realizes that people saw that or knew about it in some way, and that eventually it was going to get back to Pharaoh. And again, Pharaoh probably not so much concerned about the murder as he was concerned with Moses siding with the Hebrews there. Right? That would have been more cause for a concern for him. Verse 15, now when Pharaoh heard this thing, he sought to slay Moses, but Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So Pharaoh finds out, wants to have Moses killed. Moses flees Egypt and ends up in the land of Midian. Okay, so here's our map of Egypt and surrounding area. We'll see this a couple of times here as we kind of move through these lessons. As you can see there, I thought I had it marked a little better than what's marked on here. There's the map of the surrounding area, different places, of course, that we're going to have and look at seeing these people move as they kind of go through, as we go through this. Midian, the Gulf of Aqaba. Here it is. Sorry, yeah, Netherlands. So right So you can see how far away he went. Right, that would have been quite some distance away to get away from the hand of Pharaoh who's looking to kill him. Now, on the surface here, what did Moses' blunder in killing this Egyptian seem to do to his opportunity to live the Hebrews out? Just on the surface level, in killing this Egyptian, what does it seem to do at this point in this opportunity to live the Hebrews out of Egypt? Well, on the surface level, it seems as if what? If Moses is not in Egypt, can he lead the people out of Egypt? No, he can't, right? It's not going to work. We can't holler from Midian, right? Hey guys, you got to be there. So on the surface level, it seems like, man, he's really, really ruined this. He's really messed this up. Now, not only is he not there, but he's got the Egyptians hunting for him. And his fellow Hebrews, suspicious of him as well, because of what he had done. But we see Moses leaving there and ending up by a well. In verse 16, now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water, and filled the troughs to water their flocks. And the shepherds came and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. And when they had came to Reuel, their father, and said, How is it that ye are come so soon today? And they said, An Egyptian delivered us out of the hand of the shepherds, and also drew water enough for us and watered the flock. So, sitting there down by the well, it's not long before we see Moses doing what? Helping somebody else, right? He's intervening once again. He's stopping an injustice like he did back in Egypt. This time, though, was behalf on the 7 daughters of a Midianite who came down to water. And the Midianite priest was named Reuel. And of course, the 7 daughters there were trying to get water. The shepherds show up. Kind of see how this goes. A bunch of these roughneck beings show up and find women there at their well taking their water. They're going to try to push them out of the way and allow them to get their flocks to get water first. But we see Moses stepping in, intervening, and keeping the shepherds from chasing the daughters from the well. And I think at this point we kind of see just the command that Moses had. Right? This is one guy defending 7 daughters against a whole host of shepherds, essentially. It wasn't just 1 or 2, it had been several. And he was able to kind of either scare them away or convince them that it's a way, whatever the case may have been. He may have thumped a couple of them around a little bit and they realized somebody not to mess with. Whatever may have happened, it shows here that Moses commands some respect. He has the ability to intervene in some pretty sticky situations and figure out how to get out of them. So as a result of him doing this for these 7 daughters, Reuel gives Moses his daughter Zipporah as his wife. That's down in verse 18. Verse 20, he said to his daughters, And where is he? Why is it that he hath left the man, call him, that he hath bread? And Moses was content to dwell with the man, and he gave to Moses Zipporah his daughter, and she bare him a son, and he called his name Gershom, for he said, I have been a stranger in a strange land. So as a result of Moses doing this, we see him having a wife, and then having his first son as well. And if we flip over to Acts chapter 7, and go to verse 30. We see that right after this happened, and when 40 years were expired, there appeared to him in the wilderness of Mount Sinai an angel of the Lord in a flame of fire and bush. So Moses has left Egypt, got a wife, got a son. How long is he there in the plains of Midian? 40 years, right? 40 years now is how long he stays away and becomes a shepherd, right? That's essentially what he does here. He comes and works as his life as a shepherd, which would have been probably a little different than his life in Egypt, right? Probably so. Now we know lessons here that, or what lessons, put it that way, would Moses take away, or what lessons would Moses learn while caring for sheep in the wilderness? what are some lessons that Moses would probably learn? Patience. What else?
Be protective, maybe even more so than you.
Be more protective, maybe even more so than he was.
How to provide.
How to provide. What are sheep bad to do? Run away, right? They're prone to wander and go away, right? He would have to learn how to deal with that. Which of course would lead him to learning to care for the wandering people of God, correct? One more thing though that I want to maybe kind of see. What? Humility, absolutely. Where is Moses caring for these sheep at? In the desert, out in the wilderness. For 40 years, Moses has lived where? Before he gets to the desert, where does he live? In the palace, right? Where everything would have been right there in his beck and call. Would have been the most comfortable place in the world to live would have been the palace of Egypt at this time. Where is Moses about to spend a whole lot of his time?
In the desert.
In the desert, right? So while he's there for 40 years caring for the sheep, he's also learning how to adapt to the wilderness, right? How to live in the desert, how to come up with different things while living in the rigors of this wilderness. We can kind of see some of the lessons here that God is teaching Moses. And Pastor Rob mentioned this last week, right? He took him from a life of absolute boisterousness and luxury to teach him and allow him to be taught a lot of things there while in Egypt. Then took him to the wilderness in a completely different situation and made him learn brand new things to teach him what God wanted to teach him. Right? He allowed Egypt to be important, some important things of leading people and all this stuff, but God took him to the wilderness where he get him one-on-one, so he showed him the important lessons of life. So that when the tough times came, because we know they're going to come from Moses in a little bit, that he was not going to rely on these other experiences, he was going to rely on God. He had to. He didn't know these people, and he was doing a job he had never done before, in an area he had no idea about. He had nobody to rely on. He had to rely on God. He had to be taught these things. So we see God providentially here directing Moses his life and preparing him to lead these Hebrew slaves out of Egypt. God had already proved that he sovereignly executes his plan, despite both attempts of humans to deny it. We saw it with the 4 plans of Pharaoh. It didn't work. The human blunders to try to derail it. Moses here stepping in. Should he have killed that Egyptian? No, right? Shouldn't have happened, but he knows. So that was a blunder on Moses' part. So now we're going to see him introduce, so through this lesson, this part of lesson 1, we see God revealing that he is sovereign, right? We see the plan here of God and how he works it. As we get ready to jump into the next part here, chapter 3, we're going to see Moses, or God revealing himself to Moses as being the helper, okay? The transcendent helper as well. So, I am sovereign. Let's get over into the second part of this. Landon, if you bring that second PowerPoint for me, please. We'll start right in verse 23. We're just going to pick right up with this. And we see God being the transcendent helper. Verses 23 down through the rest of the chapter there, we're going to see God's continued plan for Israel. Okay? Alright, verses 23 through 25. Let's go right into that. And it came to pass in the process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage, and they cried, and their cry came up unto God by reason of the bondage. And God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And God looked upon his children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. So 40 years here again has passed since Moses leaves Egypt. And God's already continuing his plan for his people who are slaves there in Egypt. Now, we see, as we pick up here in verse 23, 22, 23, kind of a little bit of the account picks back up here in verse 23, and we see that Pharaoh has died, right? And this is the same Pharaoh that chased Moses out of Egypt. He's no longer there. A new Pharaoh is in place, but the conditions in Egypt had not improved for the Hebrew slaves at all. Okay, although this guy had died, this new Pharaoh had not changed things in any way. As we see in verse 23 and 24, the people of Israel are getting to the point where they're tired of this, right? They can't seem as if they can take it anymore, and we see that the Jews word that they groaned because the Egyptians are working them so hard and so difficult. Now, hard labor that was required of these Israelites was a reason and was meant to keep them from multiplying and being strong enough to rebel in any way. It was the reason why they were working in the ways that they were. So as they grew in number, as we saw last lesson, they continued to grow regardless, the work became harder and harder, right? The labor got harder and harder on them. And the building projects that they worked so hard to complete were making Egypt stronger and less vulnerable to being overthrown. And again, I have a lesson prepared for us on the things that the Hebrew people built during this time. And I think you'll be kind of surprised what they're able to accomplish. It's kind of interesting. But because of them building these things, they're just simply making Egypt stronger and stronger. So from the Hebrews people's perspective, right, they know what's going on. They get it. They know they're building these strongholds, they're building these armories, they're building all this stuff, and they realize that they're just helping the Egyptians become more and more powerful. And the more and more powerful the Egyptians came, the more and more desperate things became for the Hebrew slaves. Such a thought, of course, leads to the groaning here that we see in verses 23, 24, and 25. Now, why is it significant that the cry from Israel came up unto God? And what does the phrase communicate about God? Verse 23, let's read it again. And it came to pass in the process of time that the king of Egypt died, and the children of Israel sighed by reason of the bondage, and they cried, and their cry came up unto God by reason of the bondage. Why is it significant that these cries came up unto God? And what does the phrase there, cries coming up, what does that communicate about God? What's that?
He hears.
He hears, okay. In order for him to hear, there's an important thing here. The phrase shows that there's something important here, that God is separate from humanity. Okay? The fact that the cries had to come up to God shows that there is a separation between God and humanity. It's important. Okay? There's a reason why. He is above the earth, right? He's not there amongst the Hebrews per se. He is above the earth, so the cries had to come up to him. Now, because of that, because he is above the earth, he operates outside of the restrictions of the time and place and space that's placed on earth, right? God's timing is not the same thing as our time. He's not constrained by time. He's not constrained by space. He's not constrained by anything of the human minds that we can comprehend. Okay? So to see that in verse 23, the reason that's there is to show that he's operating on his own time. He's doing what he wants to do, what he sees sovereign to do. But even though that he is not constrained by our time and space, right? He is actively involved in what is going on here on earth. Okay? He is aware of the affairs that are taking place here on earth. Okay? The aboveness of God here is an important theme in the continuation for his plan here in Israel. This is an important thing that goes on. And we can call this transcendent. Right? We look at this as being God's transcendence. This is a characteristic of God. He is transcendent. He's not constrained by us, but He is aware of what is going on here. And He's intervening on our behalf all the time, as on the Israelites' behalf as well. Now, He is inapproachably far above humanity. Right? No one can possibly reach His level or of the character of God or even His ability. But God, through His transcendence, still hears Israel's cry. You with me? Okay, that's a kind of a little bit of a mind bender, or can be. Okay? So even though He's not constrained by us, or the ideas that we have, He is aware of what is going on. Now, this is a profound truth, okay, and one that is full of hope, not just for Israel, but for everybody. In fact, we can cry out to God who we can't physically see because He's above us, but He can still be involved in what is going on. Okay? The coming down of our transcendent God will become a repeated theme as we continue to look at the dealings with Israel. Can you think of just maybe 2 instances that are going to show up here in a little bit, just in the next couple lessons of God's transcendence, of Him coming down? What's the first big one here in a little bit? The burning bush, right? And then what else? The one I think of real quick is the white pillar, right? Smoke. That would be one. Splitting the Red Sea, Him involving Himself in 10 plagues. There's a ton of them. But that's just some instances of God transcendent coming down and dealings with Israel. Okay? So, God on high heard Israel's cry, and God on high, after He hears the cry, shows His love for Israel. And God heard their groaning, verse 24. And God remembered His covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And just as a reminder for your minds, what is the covenant that God gave to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? What is it?
The land, the multitude.
The land, the multitude, the blessing. Right? The land, the multitude, the blessing. And all 3 of those things look pretty bleak right now for the Israelites. Okay? But He hears their groaning, and He remembers the covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. Now, the remembering of this covenant here does not mean that God had forgot it and it popped back into His mind. Oh yeah, I did this, right? That's not what the remembering is there, right? That's just a reference to saying that, He knew this promise, He gave these people this promise, and He remembers giving these people this promise. Again, it just shows more of His sovereignty and more of His faithfulness to the people who He made this promise to. Because Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob now, several generations removed from the people who are in Israel, or the Israelites who are in Egypt as of right now. Okay, now, although the Hebrew slaves in Egypt don't really know it yet, God had in fact heard their groaning, and then remembered this covenant, and then we see in verse 25, looked upon them and had respect unto them. God looked upon the children of Israel, and God had respect unto them. God has never forgotten His covenant with Israel. He has and always will be faithful to the promises that He gave them. And His covenant with them is not some sort of just albatross that's hanging around His neck. Right? This is an active thing that God is always working with. For God to look upon His people, that means He was considering their situation. Right? Look down upon them and honing His focus on them, considering their situation. That shows that these Hebrew slaves are important to God. Are there other people in the world right now during this time other than the Hebrews and the Egyptians? Yes, we see it with the Midianites and the other ones as well. But God kind of puts His focus on these Hebrew slaves, showing His love and His concern for them. They were important to Him. And through His transcendence, He gives His attention to this slave nation that is in Egypt. Okay? As you see verse 25, so having respect unto them, it mentions there at the end of verse 25, He was concerned about them. That's kind of what that means, right? Having respect unto them means He was concerned about them. He had a genuine desire for their care and was going to act on their behalf out of the covenant of love, not simply just the covenant of duty. Go over to Jeremiah 31. And look at verse 3. look at how he describes, and you may not be reading this, but how he describes his love for Israel. Jeremiah 31 in verse 3. The Lord hath appeared of old unto me, saying, I have loved thee with a what? An everlasting love. Therefore with loving kindness have I drawn thee. How did he describe his love for Israel? As everlasting, right? His love for Israel is everlasting. God who sits enthroned far above humanity, okay, shows his concern for his chosen people and loves them with a love that will never end. All right? So God's continued his plan here for Israel. And he does that by there starting in chapter 3. And let's look at a couple more things and we'll be done for today. First 4 verses here of chapter 3, we see the first instance here of God's trained descendants coming down to Moses. Verse 1, now Moses kept the flock of Jethro. Okay? One of the Beverly Hillbillies, right? His father-in-law, the priest of the Midians, and he led the flock to the backside of the desert and came to the mountain of God, even to Horeb. All right, so Moses here leads Jethro's flock to the west part of Midian, and came to what is later becomes known as the mountain of God, right? And that those Horeb later becomes known as the mountain of God. Moses included the name of the mountain in retrospect here as he's writing this many years later. I mean, Moses is the writer, right, of this book. So he's kind of inserting some things here as some retrospect after he wrote this many, many years now after the event took place. By doing so, by writing that, right, by putting that in there, the mountain of God, even the he puts that in there to acknowledge the fact that God was directing his steps as he carried out this kind of mundane task of looking for food and watering this flock, right? So Moses kind of, as he's looking back on this, he's kind of realizing, I was doing some stuff there that I might not really realize what he was doing. But he kind of realizes it later on. Later, of course, we know that Moses would end up at the same mountain as the shepherd of God's people over in here in just a little bit. Sorry. So here's our map back. And we can see the location of Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai. Okay? Which is right here. Okay, Mount Sinai. Verse 2. And the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, and the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why this bush is not burned. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called unto him out of the midst of the bush, and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here am I. All right, so we know where Moses is at. See the name of the mountain that he's close to. And as he's there going through just the regular old shepherd task and making sure the flock's fed and watered, the angel of the Lord appears to Moses in the burning bush. Okay? That was not consumed by fire. And Moses turned aside to see this miracle. Now, the fact that this bush was burning and not being consumed indicated that this was from God. And the fire there, of course, indicated that God's presence, which became apparent to Moses when God called to him. All right, so let's think of this for just a second. I know this is really cool, right? The fact that there was this bush, and Moses is just there, just doing what he's done for 40 years now, making sure that this one dumb little sheep stays with everybody else, the little rascal's always running off, or running after trying to get him back, making sure the other ones are always fed and watered, nothing's coming up. And he's probably walked by this bush multiple times. Probably the first time he's been in this area. And he walks over to this bush, just boom, right? It just turns into fire. Out of nowhere, this thing just starts burning. And Moses, of course, realizes this. and sees this and kind of turns aside and kind of looks at it and wonders, maybe kind of thinks to himself, what in the world's going on? And if that isn't enough, Moses kind of sees that going on. Out of the midst of this burning bush, we hear this voice, right, that starts calling out. Now the bush is talking to Moses and calling him by his name. Moses, Moses. And now as we see, though, at this point, this is when this becomes completely and entirely relevant to Moses that this is in fact God. Okay? The burning bush at first, probably something could have happened, probably really strange, but he doesn't really realize that it's God until the bush speaks out and says to him, Moses, Moses. We see that because of his response of saying, here I am. Now, what is the connection here, right? Back what we just read in verse 23 of chapter 2. What is the connection between verse 23 and verse 4 here, between Israel's cry, and God's call? What's the connection? Israel cried out, God heard it. What's the connection here in verse 4? To who? Moses, right? God hears the call, so he calls back to Moses in a response to Israel's cry. Comes down and calls Moses out. Okay? Later in the passage here, we see over in verse 9, we'll get to it today. But God said that he had come down to rescue his people. Let's look at verse 8. We'll be back at verse 8 next week. It's the beginning that says what? And I did what? Come down. So we see his transcendence, right? We see the fact that he was aware, but he had to come down to take care of this situation. Okay? The result of him coming down was because of, we see that if you look in verse 9, now therefore behold the what? What's the first part of that verse say? The cry. So we see the cry of the children of Israel is the reason that God had to come down. Okay? So we see now, we don't see any conversations, probably not the best word, actual God directly influencing Moses' life. We see him pulling some strings, moving in places, but we don't see direct connection or direct intervention in Moses' life until right now. Right? Much later on in his life. This is the first time God actually, physically, the first of multiple, there's going to be a couple times God does this. This is the first time that he actually shows up in Moses' life. And essentially is going to tell him, Moses, I have a job for you. And then, of course, we know what's going to happen from there. And we'll get more into that next week. Now that Moses has come down, or God has come down to Moses, we're going to see some of the commands that God gives to Moses as well, and some of the excuses and things that Moses is going to come up with as he begins to realize that, oh man, God's got a big job for me. I don't know if I was going to do this wrong. Okay, so we'll get into that more next week. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this lesson of Moses and the life that we're able to study and the lessons and truths that are within it. And although it's a rather familiar story to us, one we've heard multiple times, Lord, it never ceases to amaze us and leave us kind of slack jawed with the fact that some of the things that you did in the lives of these people, Pharaoh, one, is not getting it the first time. We see later on the Israelites, it's over and over and over and over and over again. See you do some things and then just forget very quickly the way you intervene for them. I pray as we see that, we think how silly can they be. We oftentimes would do the exact same thing to you as well. So our brother, as we continue to look at the life of Moses and the people that he led out of Egypt as well, and the way that you orchestrated this whole thing, it's a constant reminder to us that first of all, you're faithful